Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Green Health Forum 24 Making the News workshop. Hashtag Climate Health Stories of Croakey Health Media and Lena. We'll introduce ourselves in a second. But first, an introduction to how we'll run this session. We'll have several short and sharp exercises that will build and encourage you to get thinking about climate health stories in your local community or that matter to you. And over this time together, we really encourage you to use the chat for comments and also questions, and we'll respond to those throughout. And also, we ask that you have a listen, put your binangs on, have a listen, your ears, to our climate health stories that we'll use to introduce ourselves today. And with the picture on the screen, you'll see 4 young lads together with a beautiful blue sky in the background. And this is on Daby Wiradjuri country. I'm Mudgee Wiradjuri and identify as Wiradjuri, and we have Palawa bloodline as well. And this is a picture of the Northeast Wiradjuri Company's very generous offer to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here on Daby country to be involved in the in cultural burn practices. And we've had a couple of opportunities recently to be trained in fireground supervisors and in doing cultural burns and cool burns and working with rural fire service and a couple of fire consulting companies. So we've got quite a broad network developed. And this is our next generation. These lads are between 14 and 17 years of age, and the absolute privilege it is for us to work with elders and work across 4 generations to learn about these important practices for arguably bushfire prevention, for promoting biodiversity, and also promoting our social ties, our connections, our culture, and our own individual well-being. So that's a very brief introduction to my climate health story. And it's also in line with Wiradjuri cultural protocol, but also cultural safety. Cultural safety definition of APRA says that that's the critical self-reflection of the health professional. And we got to get some practice at talking about ourselves and our positionality, because that's so foundational to relationality. And if we want to do cultural safety, we have to know cultural stuff. And Indigenous peoples worldwide are relational cultures. But I've also been trained as a health professional, and we were trained to separate our personal frame of reference from our professional and our organisational frame of reference, and to leave ourselves behind at the door when we come to work. But Aboriginal way, it's so different. We're so savvy and so skilled and experienced at critically reflecting and knowing which part of ourselves is influencing our work. And it really permissions us to bring our whole selves into the work that we do, or into how we relate with climate and health stories and catastrophes. So we really encourage you to use this time to get a bit of practice. It's a very subtle, gentle process. Sometimes it might not feel like we're doing enough, but it's so foundational to taking action later, getting to know ourselves and getting some skills in relating, building our networks among trusted people to be able to draw on those for ongoing support, and then being able to cast our stories forward. And so I'll invite Ruth to speak next about her climate story, and also my colleagues to contribute to any housekeeping and any other suggestions for all of you who are joining in. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands, Daby, that ever present, the ancestral spirits throughout our waterways, our sky, and all of our stories throughout our generations. And think about our black and deadly mob coming forward into the future, and think about and feel ancestral country that all of you who are joining us today are coming from, and our deep respect to those traditional custodians whose work with country has been profound and is ongoing and occurs in so many seen and unseen ways that it's quite thrilling to think that we could tune in and continue to carry the world's oldest living cultures forward. It's such a privilege. And our deep acknowledgement too of all Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today with huge responsibilities, sorry to mention, cultural load or colonial load, and the multiple hats that mobs often wear, and the ongoing support that we need from our allies. And for those of you who've joined today, with all of the work that you do with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander elders and middle-aged people like me and our next generations, Mundung, thank you. Maybe Indigenous people from all over the world who've joined us too. Our binangs are open to hear our stories from your ancestors and your elders and leaders as well. So on that note, you're getting to know us a little bit about how Croakey works so gently and together. And Ruth, I'll invite you to introduce yourself and your story.
Thank you, Meg. That's a fantastic challenge for us all. And yes, we're all going to tell you some stories, some climate stories today. But I'm a Croakey Health Media member and editor. And my background is as a GP and a medical journal editor. And I'm also a writer of short fiction. And today I'm coming to you from Wongal land in Sydney's inner west. I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and the elders past and present, and join Meg in acknowledging all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present on this chat today. Thank you. But the photo second from the left on screen comes from somewhere else. It doesn't come from Wongal land. In recent years, I've spent a lot of time on Yunbunun Magnetic Island on the lands of the Walgarakapa people off the coast of Townsville. And these photos were taken last year by a local photographer and marine biologist, Lawrence Shiel. And in December last year, when I was up on the island, I asked Lawrence if he could pair and frame these photos for me. They were taken at Yunbunun's Arthur Bay, a place where I just love to walk and snorkel. By the time I picked up the photos from Lawrence, more than 60% of the coral in Arthur Bay had been destroyed by Cyclone Carré, which passed directly over the island in late January 2024 and exacerbated the already stressed reef with the effects of the summer heat waves. So Shelley, the turtle in the second photo, wasn't seen for a long time after the storm, but when I spoke to Lawrence, he said she'd been recently seen again. There wasn't much property damage from Carré, but the fragile fringing reef around Yunbunun got a hiding. The economics effects of rising temperatures and increased cyclone events in North Queensland are well known. The insurance premiums have become progressively less affordable, and the policies you can purchase have very stringent claims criteria and low caps for cyclone damage. And of course, there have been recent government initiatives aimed at relief for people's hip pockets in the region. What remains unmeasured, however, is the immense ecological grief when you live in a place where all you have to do is put on a pair of goggles and step off the beach to see the environment collapsing around you. One positive takeaway from this is that the Yunbunun Magnetic Island community has been galvanised into collaborative climate action. There's a community action plan led by the Walgarakapa owners and rangers, community groups, scientists and local authorities. And this includes lots of creative projects that have immense buy-in to switch to total renewable energy, marine and wildlife protection and zero waste programs. When I'm on the island, I see these initiatives being lived out from the people building shade for the turtle nest to those cleaning up the mangroves to First Nations marine education programs and citizen science to monitor the local reefs. So every local community has climate and health stories, and my colleagues are going to tell you a few more, and I encourage you as we go on to think about your own. So over to you, Nell.
Thanks, Ruth. Yes, I'm Nell. I'm from the Local and Independent News Association and was kindly invited by Croakey to be a part of this workshop today. And I'll talk a little more about news and media later in this workshop and how it intersects with these issues. But reflecting on my own climate health story, I was thinking about how I'm quite a bit more disconnected from the environment in my life now, where I live on the Wurundjeri country, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne, versus growing up on Dja Dja Wurrung country in central Victoria, where I felt like the environment had a much greater impact on my day-to-day life. Certainly impacted by water restrictions, stage 4 water restrictions. I remember collecting shower water in a bucket to bring out to the garden, and definitely strong memories of high fire danger days and school shutting down, preparing for summer by clearing gutters and receiving emergency sort of bushfire evacuation kits in the mail to prepare for certain events that affect a lot of people living in the countryside. So that was my reflection when I was thinking about my climate health story. And you can see in the bottom right photo, there's a little photo of regrowth on a burnt tree after a planned burning off in the region around my childhood house, which is a common site. So I was just reflecting on how much more present the environment was in my life back then, and it was a nice opportunity to think about perhaps the ways it still does affect me in my city life now. So that's my climate health story, and I'll pass over to you, Melissa.
Thanks so much, Nell and Ruth and Meg, and hello to everyone. My name is Melissa Sweet. I'm a public health journalist of Scottish, English and Chinese ancestry and a member and director of Croakey Health Media. I pay my respects to the Malakadi people of Lutruwita, where I live and work, and to elders and ancestors and your long-standing care for country and communities. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining this Zoom and contributing to work and to care in this space. So the photo I'm going to talk to is the one on the top right of a crowd of people. It's from a recent community gathering that I attended. It was taken on the 26th of October at a place just over an hour's drive north from where I live. The people in this photo had stunning views from those windows that you can see from the Carlton Park Surf Life Saving Club over a much loved local beach. If you look closely in the photo, sort of about the centre of it, you might spot a well-known retired politician in the crowd, Bob Brown. Now, this big group turned out on a Saturday night because of their love for their local environment and their concerns about the predictable impacts of plans to expand salmon farming in the area. This meeting is one of a number of activities planned to resist the expansion of this damaging but politically powerful industry. The meeting heard from First Nations people, scientists, environmental advocates and community members. The issues weren't presented to the community as a climate health story. However, it is a climate health story, and not only because warming waters are certain to exacerbate the harmful impacts of this industry upon waterways, ecosystems, and the well-being of people and communities, and the salmon themselves. This story is also a reminder of how the destruction of country is part of wider systems and worldviews that contribute to the climate crisis and warming temperatures, the prioritisation of a powerful industry and commercial determinants over the health of people and country. It's a reminder too of the longest history of the custodianship of country, and this is the foundation of all climate health stories. The NOFs, or Neighbours of Fish Farms group, have a website which I really encourage you to check out. It has some fantastic videos telling stories from local communities about the impact of salmon farming, including one from Flinders Island, where the community came together with local Aboriginal leadership and united in successfully resisting an attempt to introduce fish farms into those pristine waters. You can contribute to this resistance by choosing not to eat or buy salmon produced in these cruel and damaging conditions. To think, I used to see this as a healthy food choice before I learned better. So that's a climate health story from here in the south. And now I think we're going to go to a breakout room and our next slide, and I'll pass you back to Meg.
Mandang, thank you. Yes, if we can have the slide that's got exercise 1 on it. And what you've already seen from us is us making introductions to ourselves and describing stories that matter, climate stories that matter, and that solid protocol of that introduction and storying. We're trying to role model that. I can already think of lots of things I would change about how I introduced myself, and probably all the gaps and things I didn't say. And that's so essential to have that opportunity to reflect on something that I've done, that reflective practice that we know really well from being health professionals, for those of you who are health professionals here. I've got a little bit of something I'm feeling to reflect on. And it cannot be understated that introducing ourselves well and telling us our stories takes practice. And that's a little bit of what we'd like to do now, reflective and connecting and storying. What are your reflections on the things that we've just shared? We don't have a real opportunity here to do lots of talking together like we might in person in a group, but if we could use the chat, often we can have sort of deeper responses in some ways when we use the chat. So in the chat, what are your reflections on the stories we've shared? And what comes to mind for you and your communities about climate health? Would you put something in the chat that we might be able to respond to? Otherwise, these questions are, 3 little questions we will often ask a variation of. Reflecting on what we've heard, what does it bring from mind to mind for us? And how can we share that with others? Well, I can't see much coming through, whether we've got some shy attendees, perhaps. But there's nothing like a quiet moment to sit and feel, think of the past and the present and the future, about what matters to us. May I share the comment from Sarah Phillips about stage 4 water restrictions? that's resonated. And she remembers having to stand in the shower with a bucket, and I definitely remember that as well. I had little kids at the time, and then mum using that water to wash clothes and putting it on the garden. So it really gave a appreciation of waterways and what a precious resource water is. Yeah, that gives me goosebumps remembering that, and I'm grateful in a way to bring up little kids at that time to bucketing water, sharing water around. And for me as well, my dad lived on boats for many years. If we went to visit, we would have to cart our own water and identify for how many days, how much, particularly drinking water we needed and washing up. And even though we were on the water, knowing that difference between salt water and fresh water for human life. Any other stories people would like to share? And also, if we've got any questions, I could probably talk quite a lot more about cultural burning and cool burns and the great differences in the way rural fire service work compared to my cousin's company as well, and what we expect to happen in the future. And I might just pass over and invite Melissa. Is there anything else you'd like to add about your story, and Nell and Ruth?
Sarah would love to hear more from you, Meg. So I was just thinking about the connections between our stories in a way, and how much I'd love to hear from health services as well about their stories, but we can come to that later. But I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that's such a great point, is part of us being able to introduce ourselves and tell our stories, and which requires quiet time to think and connect with our own stories, is that principle of finding the similarities rather than the differences. And the more similarities we can find, obviously, the more bond we find and the more time we can relate and develop trust. And that other little saying that things seem to move at the speed of trust. And then when difficulties come up, we've got that trust to be able to rely on and negotiate our way forward. That's so important, like for keeping me safe within a work environment and community environment. And probably before I go on, we've got Lynn from Melbourne, living in Melbourne for the last few years, stopped using heating in their home as a way of personally reducing emissions and highlighting to friends how important collective climate action is. It really is, and that collective, it makes such a difference, working together with other people, being together with other people. Yeah. My story about cultural burning too is, I'm a middle-aged woman, not particularly useful in carting heavy things now or driving. I don't drive a full drive very well. But my role within that community is also pretty obvious, about setting things up, making plans, checking in on people, facilitating people who are not participating quite so much, or people who are taking too much responsibility. Yeah, I definitely had that really enjoyable safety role. And our climate action starts with very clear planning and ensuring that everybody is on the same page, understands their role, and also is able to have a bit of stretch, develop some skills. And so we spend some time also thinking about what new skills people want to learn, and also multi-skilling people on the fire ground too, so we don't get overexposed, say, to smoke or to one practice, but are able to understand right across the fire ground what's required. And then that way, if people do need to pull back, we're able to step in as well. Yeah. And yeah, that fire ground experience is it's exhilarating on the one hand, but it's very calm on the other hand, because we know that it was cultural practice, and being grounded in that is such a profound experience. And also bringing others on in the community along, because our access to land to burn requires often permission of non-Indigenous landowners, and their generosity on the one hand in providing access to Wiradjuri people to care for country. And so it takes a lot to unpack that too. That's a very bittersweet experience of that reminder of the removal of our people from land, and in this area through massacres generally. But the humility that we also experience now, being able to come back to country and continue that practice. But we're often thinking that it was never gone, it was always here waiting for the right people at the right time to be able to continue those practices. And for us, you saw in that photo vesting the skills in the next generations in such an obvious way. Yeah. We've got another comment from Joanna M in Melbourne on Wurundjeri country, a one-car household, and husband uses a 25-year-old car to drive to work, whereas Joanne can commute between home and work by train, and then using a bike to run errands and attending community events. Yeah, we agree, Naomi. Awesome effort, and sort of it takes that bit of planning, doesn't it? And again, working as a collective in that family and getting those agreements about how to do things. There's lots we take for granted that we do, but when we stop and think about what we're doing, you can see there's common principles and practices that can get applied in a bigger, arguably a bigger collective setting. Ruth says, yeah, domestic acts of climate action. And Michelle from Bunurong country, home is built to withstand extremities, has a designated safe hub for extreme weather events. They've hosted elderly neighbours in extreme heat, offer power in storms, hosted community during fires. My goodness. As a hospital leader, Michelle sought out community leaders and getting their support on the ground. Power, telecommunications, right down to community grapevine to work and feed in information from emergency services. So many actions packed within one paragraph there. Well, it's very affirming, isn't it? And the multiple connections being made there. Joanna said, Naomi, that reminds her of bushfires experienced in Victoria during COVID. A really new experience to use those N95 masks to avoid breathing in the smoke that hung around the city for weeks. Yeah, definitely. My experience with fireground, being a fireground is, wearing masks and that personal protective equipment, but it sort of came in handy. I was much more able to pick it up. It was familiar to me from working in healthcare at times. Thank you. I think that it really shows us, reflecting brings up so much experience that we've already got, and that climate action like climate catastrophes occur at the individual level and for families and communities, as well as at this system level. But a lot of the principles and the skills are applicable for working as family units and in communities, and are likely very useful for broader, higher level advocacy at the system level. Well, thank you for that, our first little exercise. I'm going to invite Melissa to have a yarn next about the media landscape and, honour her incredible long-term experience and being able to talk about the media landscape in 5 minutes or so. Melissa, over to you.
Thanks so much, Meg, and to everyone who contributed some stories there. Just going to the platform organisers, would you be able to move us to the breakout room now, if that's okay? Okay. Great. And if you could also move us to the next slide when we join. Oh, okay. Okay, we'll stay here then. We didn't realise we'd lose the slides. Okay. Okay, sorry everyone. Okay, we will move on now. So we've just shared some personal stories and reflections, and now we might move to some bigger picture structural issues. And I'm just going to give a very quick overview talking to these two images here. And as I do, I'd really encourage you to think about how you, in your very many roles, whether as citizens or employees or as sectoral representatives, might be able to engage in some of these issues. So to the first photo, polluting, damaging and toxic. This photo speaks volumes about the state of our news and information systems, which are a fundamental upstream determinant of our health. You only have to look to recent news from the United States, an oil industry executive to run the energy department and an anti-vaxxer to run health, to get an understanding of the impact of our current news and information environment. In this session, I'd like to encourage you to look beyond the practices of individual journalists or media organisations to consider some of the wider factors that have led us here. These include the collapse of the business model that used to sustain public interest journalism, as the rivers of gold advertising migrated to Google, Meta et al., and the failure of policymakers and also civil society to respond appropriately. It's meant the loss of thousands of media jobs, the contraction of newsrooms, the emergence of news deserts, and the undermining of public interest journalism and our shared public square. Another factor is the failure of policymakers to ensure media diversity. Instead, our mainstream media landscape is dominated by a few large corporates and newsrooms and structures that often do not represent the communities they serve. Another important factor has been the global failure to regulate big tech. So these companies have built a very successful and largely unaccountable business model based upon extractive surveillance, harmful marketing, dissemination of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, as well as the direct undermining of journalism through a variety of techniques, including algorithms that inhibit the sharing of news. This situation is exploited by anti-public health interests, whether the fossil fuels, gambling, alcohol, or other industries, as well as far-right and other malevolent agendas. The result is increasing polarisation, mistrust of institutions and science, and the undermining of rights and respect, and very low levels of climate and climate health literacy as well. Regular readers will know that Croakey is often encouraging the health sector to engage with media policy, to uphold communities' rights to a safe, relevant and reliable news and information environment. This can be done in a few ways. Firstly, by bringing a media policy lens to important health discussions. I'm not talking about developing a communication strategy. It means when you're working on important climate health issues, consider if there are any implications for media policy. Another way your sector can help support healthier news and information systems is by bringing a climate health lens to media policy, so the other side of that coin. When there are policy opportunities, for example, as currently with the misinformation and disinformation bill, then engage with these through a lens that recognises the importance of media policy for climate health responses. Have you or your representatives, for example, ever met with the communications minister or those other areas responsible or bearing on media landscape? Croakey's submissions to various inquiries are available on our website, and you're very welcome to draw upon them if they're useful. For example, our submission to the development of the National Health and Climate Strategy called for a whole of government approach to enable policies that support development of a news and information system that is reliable, relevant, and safe for communities engaging with climate mitigation and adaptation. We said this requires policies to tackle misinformation, disinformation, racism, and polarisation, as well as the market dominance of companies such as Meta, Google, and News Corp. We also recommended the development of philanthropy and reforms to support the growth and development of not-for-profit media organisations. As you may know, Croakey is a not-for-profit public interest journalism organisation. There's only really a handful of us operating in Australia, and there's great potential to grow this sector to meet underserved community needs. The health sector can also play a very direct role in developing and sustaining a healthy media environment. It might be by supporting your local or independent media through advertising or subscriptions or other means, or supporting the development of new and emerging media models. And we can look to Croakey, thank and acknowledge the directors on our board, including Meg, who are people with busy, demanding jobs in other spheres, but giving their time to support media. Likewise, thanks to contributors who supported our development of these draft principles, as shown on that second image on the slide, to guide development of safer communications infrastructure. I think it's so important that we remember our need for reliable, timely, relevant news and information is only going to grow as the climate crisis intensifies. So if we could go to our next slide, please. So we'll do another exercise via the chat. So it's just, hopefully some of those comments might have triggered some ideas or creative thoughts. We'd really love to hear from you. They're just our brain dump, I guess, but I'm sure you have lots of other ideas for how you, whether as individuals or organisations or professional bodies, might be able to engage with media policy or creating healthier forms of media. So if you have any suggestions or experiences you'd like to share, please put them in the chat. I know it's a bit of a big ask, but we're also very welcome to engage with you around these issues afterwards as well by email. But in the meantime, and Meg and Nell and Ruth, extend that invitation to you as well. Great, if you want to put some comments in the chat, if you've got ideas for the group as well. And Meg's just put a comment in the chat. So, media policy. Do people learn about it as part of their work? Is it in health and medical journals? Is it in your professional development? Is it in your climate health discussions and advocacy? Very keen to hear what people in the Zoom room have to say about this. And Nell, I know Lena is doing a lot of great work in this space, and that you're going to be talking about that very soon. But do jump in if you want to mention anything that Lena is doing that you think could be added to that policy discussion. Thank you. A comment there about being careful about choosing sources. Ria, is that in relation to media, or you're talking more generally in terms of engaging on social media, who you choose to amplify or not? it's a very tricky space, social media, isn't it? I think about, that's been my job really, is, a long career assessing information very quickly, what's reliable, what's not. And it is very difficult in the social media space. And it's not surprising that people for whom this is not their day job do inadvertently amplify and share unreliable or damaging content. We've put the onus in the wrong place on individuals rather than the companies that profit from this. Rebecca's made a comment about policy restricting research and information. Is that to journal? Yeah. I hope someone's photographing these comments. Good. Okay. Please continue to drop your thoughts there. Thanks, Rebecca. I'm just conscious of time as well. And as I said, we welcome any follow-up thoughts. But now I will pass you over to Nell, and we will need the next slide. And Nell is going to be speaking to you about the work of the local and Independent News Association, LENA. Croakey is a member, and we are so grateful for the work that they do. It's one of the few good news stories in media policy.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, we do like to sometimes refer to ourselves and to the publishers that we're representing as the green shoots of the industry in transition or crisis. So that's a more optimistic outlook on some of the challenges that Melissa has been talking about. Yes, so I'm Policy and Strategic Communications Officer at LENA. LENA is an industry association supporting independent and local digital news publications in Australia. And our goal is to support public interest journalism and the sustainability and capacity of these newsrooms to foster a vibrant and diverse news media landscape, which is so important. Supporting now over 130 newsrooms across all states and territories in Australia, but we only started welcoming members a little over 2 years ago. So the organisation was formed to try to support these publishers operating and emerging in what is essentially an industry in crisis. As Melissa has discussed, we've seen the globally, the traditional advertising-based business model for news media has collapsed as audiences have shifted onto this online spaces, and this has caused many news organisations to contract or shut down entirely, leaving many areas of Australia and the world completely unserviced by local quality news, which is a phenomenon we call news deserts. So research from the Public Interest Journalism Initiative shows that there has been a net change of about 180 newsrooms decreased around Australia since January 2019. And this is a massive problem for democracy and for all the issues that affect us as individuals and communities, including health and environment, of course. Local news is so important for debunking mis and disinformation, which the World Economic Forum has recently named the greatest short-term global threat. And local news in particular is really important to identifying this fake news when it's circulating with communities, because journalists are so embedded within these communities that they're reporting in and for. They have eyes and ears on the ground, so they're much quicker to identify harmful information as it spreads. Local news is also extremely important to facilitate community connection, democratic engagement, and representing diverse voices that are often unrepresented in a really consolidated media market with just a few powerful owners. Local news acts as a watchdog, holding leaders and authorities accountable, and supports local businesses and events. And a big one is delivering critical information in times of crisis. So a lot of the publications Lena is supporting emerged during the pandemic, when community members identified that there was this lack of quality, verified and locally specific health information available in their community. And the same for other emergencies. So during floods or bushfires, for example, local news isn't just there running the live blog during these events, delivering sometimes life-saving information about evacuation routes and similar really important information. But these publishers are also there in the lead up to these events, supporting community resilience and staying on to cover the aftermath and recovery efforts when a lot of larger news publications tend to have already moved on to a news event happening elsewhere. As we all know, the news cycle is so rapid and constantly changing and moving on to the next focus. So our work at Lena is focused on providing both representation for these publications in the policy space, working on some of the issues that Melissa has spoken about, but also providing really hands-on capacity building support to strengthen these newsrooms' ability to produce public interest journalism, and by generating economies of scale through networking and shared services for digital newsrooms. And one key factor in all of this is that we do have some requirements for member newsrooms so that we can ensure that it's just quality news services that are accessing our support. So these hallmarks of membership include publications must be independently owned and operated. There must be engaging journalists within the communities that they're reporting on, and they must be maintaining a strong set of editorial guidelines and producing public interest journalism. So with that, we might move on to the next slide, and you can see up there some of the publications that Lena's representing, and that might help jog your brains as we move into our next exercise as well, which is I'd like to invite you to consider your own local media landscape and where you get your own news, whether this is a local publication or perhaps you're mainly just accessing statewide or national news. So please feel free to pop some responses in the discussion. Another thing to consider is if you are mainly accessing statewide or national news, why is that so? Is it perhaps you live in a news desert where there is no local news service, or there is no local news service that's reflecting, or reporting within strong editorial guidelines, or perhaps you're just not aware of what's out there in your local communities. It can be harder to get for small publications to break through and get that brand awareness. We all know how to access the ABC. It's sometimes difficult to know how do you find my own local service. Ria says, getting out and about, doing my own bit for amplifying community work and accurate health messaging. Melissa mentioned Facebook groups. Yeah, providing details of community events. A lot of local news publications have sprung up from Facebook groups where, just individuals within the community were providing this kind of information gathering service, and then moved on to more, what would say, professional or like legitimized platforms like a news website. Yeah, Melissa mentioned as well that there's very little news about local council activities or accountability. And yeah, that really relies on local news services to have that sort of reporting, because as you can imagine, big publications aren't necessarily sending in their reporters to cover on small council activities, but we know that this is so important for communities and democracy. Yeah, Michelle's mentioned it takes a lot of effort to avoid global clickbait. Sometimes it has to be quite intentional to seek out quality news services. I'm enjoying reading the responses. Keep them coming. I think we might pass on to Meg as well to keep speaking in the meantime.
Yeah, thank you, Nell, and yeah, wonderful to have Lena here with us and to hear more about Lena and its important role. And yeah, green shoots was great to hear about too. And yeah, I'm going to go on a little bit of a different tangent and talk about just justice as an example of something that I think is really useful methodology, and probably what we would call a decolonizing methodology as well, partly by having more Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people's voices involved, which then tends to change how things are done. And for me, this was how I first became involved with Croakey Health Media, through Just Justice. I'd been doing a PhD in Brisbane, and I'd written interviews into people's life stories and also into advocacy publications, and a group of us developed Project 10%, an Aboriginal community organisation. We were advocating for reducing prison rates by 10% a year for 10 years, and had a number of pillars and a strategy outlined for doing that based on community workshops and a survey and my PhD research. And I moved to UNSW, and Professor Raina McIntyre, who was head of the School of Public Health and Community Medicine at UNSW at the time, had seen a Croakey Health Media, or a Croakey flyer, wasn't incorporated as we are now, Croakey flyer advertising Just Justice. And I was lucky enough to come involved after the funds for it had already been raised. So a big shout out to Croakey, who were involved in crowdfunding, and also the leadership of Dr. Summer May Finlay, Yorta Yorta colleague, who's been involved in Croakey for a long time. And it was wonderful of Raina to understand my strengths and my interests in not just being data for research, but committed to knowledge translation to wide audiences. And she saw how Croakey reaches wide audiences. And it's becoming involved in Just Justice, and in some of the success strategies were things like our planning and our focus and using our networks. And Croakey's Just Justice series produced 90 articles in about a 12-month period, 90 articles from 70 authors, and about half of those authors, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. So it kind of flies in the face of, that sort of, it's hard to get Aboriginal people involved, and they, we never hear their voices. Well, we had such leadership in Just Justice. And we used our networks to create interest in being involved, and then people telling their own stories using the online platform of Croakey's website to publish articles. For me personally, learning how to write in 800 words rather than 10,000 words, and also choosing feature image, choosing headlines, choosing quotes, And so those authors Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander authors who were involved in Just Justice, obviously also getting the chance to learn and practice these skills. The Just Justice articles also become very visual and very shareable. They're tangible for us to speak to our families and our friends and our communities to say, here's something I've done, or here's something some other mob's written. Would you like to do that in your area? Rather than the sort of unwieldy, high, weird concept of writing an article for online. We ended up with a real diverse amount of articles to show what was possible, and other people coming involved because they want a bit of that for their own communities. And you can see on the screen there the Federal Health Minister at the time holding our Just Justice book. Those 90 articles were bound together in this beautiful book. We had funds from our university to help us do a second print run, for example, as a form of knowledge translation related to research. And we literally delivered hard copies of those books to Parliament House, to other parliamentarians' offices, and took the opportunity to take photos and write a story about that, which just kept furthering and furthering the reach of Just Justice. Also, at that time, there wasn't a lot in the sort of general domain about health service access for people in prison, or for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prison. We already had Closing the Gap Commonwealth strategy, and we also have public health associations, justice health conferences every now and then. But we didn't have anything in Closing the Gap about deaths in custody or about healthcare access for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in custody. We think that by creating this enormous amount of content and tangible products for us to use in advocacy, we were able to really specify the need for justice targets. And through our networks, published, for example, in the Medical Journal of Australia about the need for justice targets. And we can't say for sure that Just Justice led to there being justice health targets in Closing the Gap, but there are justice health targets in Closing the Gap, that obviously is bipartisan commitment to levels of government to address. And I work here in New South Wales on and I do evaluations related to the New South Wales implementation plan. And so one of those is about through care. So for me, going all the way back to doing my PhD, beginning in 2007, about through care, the right that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have, according to a number of human rights instruments and legislation, to be cared for when they enter police custody, through court, incarceration periods, and post-prison release, then that is connecting. That's sort of almost a generational change that the old ANTAR and others Close the Gap campaign called for, change in a generation. And so for me now to be here working on through care program evaluation, linked to New South Wales Closing the Gap implementation plan, linked to justice targets being in Closing the Gap, I can only but draw those threads back to this enormous amount of visual and storying that the Just Justice campaign led to. We've also published in the Australian Journalism Review, and our commitment to getting in peer-reviewed literature so that we can also influence curriculum, which is that next generation of both healthcare professionals and professionals in the media landscape and in social policy as well. And sort of such a wonderful story, and we'll share some links to that. But So on that, it was sort of a way of showing what's possible by being focused and making a decision and having a plan. And to just take that opportunity now to do that. And so if we go to the next slide, to brainstorm projects, and you heard me mention before spheres of influence, and how I had to leave aside my personal from my professional and organizational domains. Well, that spheres of influence is also in campaigning and activism, and this is about taking a moment to just stop and think, who is in your sphere of influence yourself? And we've seen in the chat lots of sort of use of Facebook and other forums. But just if you've got a bit of paper in front of you or something that you can start to clarify and tease apart your spheres of influence. Often the different actors in the networks need different strategies to be engaged with and be involved with, but sometimes not. You never know. So this process of kind of fracturing, for our qualitative researchers out there, breaking apart the whole to see each part clearly, to then make a plan, then see the commonalities in the plan, to then make a more focused plan. Yeah, so the simple question is, who's in your spheres of influence? Take a couple of moments to think about that. You can jot those in the chat to help stimulate other people's thoughts. Sometimes I use the layers of the onion, and probably lots of you as well, or socio-ecological model, SEM, with individual, and I use Aboriginal family and non-Aboriginal family. They're really different in my world. And then Aboriginal community and general community, and then organisations, and then policy, and then system. And those layers of the onion. So an example for a starting point. Yeah, so who's in my sphere of influence? I'm here in the centre of the universe in Kandos on Davey country, and we have Kandos Community Capers newsletter and KRR radio. So those are two essential places, and the Northeast Wiradjuri Company. We've got the Ralston Ramblers as well. Yay, KRR. Ralston Ramblers have been going a long time. They're a real sort of backbone in our community. And our school and a Aboriginal Education Consultative Group are definitely a go-to. And then over in the region, the Midwest Council. So we've got an event coming up, Croakey Go. We'll talk to you a little bit more about that, but a walking event. So for me, it's protocol here to work with those in my sphere of influence to support our aim with Croakey Go, for example. In person, we do a sphere of influence. We've used paper plates, and you get everyone to write a different actor in their network on paper plates, and then you can see across a group who's got similar sort of little hubs in their networks too, and create those connections. Yeah, weave things together that way. But we'll go over to you, Ruth. So if we've had a little think about the who, who do we try and influence? And Ruth will talk us through a bit of the how.
Yes, thank you, Meg. Can we have the next slide, please? Great, there it is. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about how you might turn your stories into publications for climate and health activism. And then we're going to do a bit of a pitching exercise. And I think great to keep your sphere of influence in mind for who you're going to pitch to, apart from anything else. Yeah. And I'm going to focus here on just how to write a short opinion piece, maybe 850 to 1,000 words. But I think you can relate a lot of this to other formats as well. And if you've got an idea already, please keep it in the back of your mind as we go, because it's going to come in handy for our little exercise. So first of all, the slide on the left, here's a few questions to ask yourself when you're getting started. First one's very obvious. What are you going to write about? What points do you want to get across? And I think you've probably all been thinking about this as we've been talking today. And it's a great idea, a great little exercise to actually just try and encapsulate your message before you start into a few decisive little sentences. The next question is where, and I would suggest asking this question next. So who is your audience and what platform is going to be appropriate to publish on? This includes things like sorry, I've lost it. Oh, yeah. So you can go from very local to like newsletters, work newsletters, community newsletters, through to sort of health media, if you want your message to go there, through to newspapers, and think about whether your message is local, national, or international. Social media platforms, all the traditional ones, plus, think outside the square. Maybe it's going to be a TikTok or a YouTube video or just a LinkedIn story or a Spotify, a podcast on Spotify. And of course, think about medical journals, whether it's Australian or international, specialist or generalist, whether it's a conference presentation. And don't forget literary or industry journals as well, and magazines, which are often picked up by the general media. In this case, the pitch is going to be really important. And before you do that, before you make your pitch to your chosen platform, have a look and read or look at what that publication actually publishes and see what formats they publish in. And then by all means, pitch it. Which brings me to the how. How are you going to present your story or idea of our opinion? And I do believe that the how probably should come third, because if you think about it, if you've addressed the where, and you may be guided by that platform. For instance, if the editor says, well, that sounds more like a letter to the editor, or it's going to be more suitable for our newsletter, you can save yourself a lot of work by sort of massaging it to their formats. And again, this can be any of the traditional formats, post for LinkedIn, opinion article, letter, but also TikToks, podcasts, videos on YouTube. And my last plea is don't forget creative writing. So personal essays, stories, and poetry, these can be just so impactful if that's your bent, and they're worth pitching to editors as well. So just a few general tips here on the right. Sustain just a couple of themes or ideas, and this is where doing the what exercise is a good idea. You can't say too much in one article. Maybe there's 2 or 3 articles in it. Who knows? The second thing is to look at what's already out there. And it doesn't mean you can't say it again or say it to a different audience, but most publications will be looking for what's new. The next thing is use your references. And by this, I just mean, obviously you need references to substantiate facts, especially if they're contentious. But you can also use references to extend what you're saying and make a reference to something that's been elucidated more fully elsewhere. Apart from anything else, it'll keep you happy and brief. The next tip is to have a first reader. It's very important to have someone you trust to go in cold, and do that quite early in the process so that you can make changes if you're off track. The next point, anticipate dissenting views. So the piece will be stronger if you include and address some of the common obstacles that people might raise in response to your work. And finally, just include, if you can, concrete steps for a way forward. I mean, sometimes it's important just to raise an issue or tell a story, but as an editor, I would always be looking for some advice on how to move the dial on the issue that's been raised. And the more concrete you can be, the better it usually is. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is a bit formulaic and probably pretty obvious, but this is a simple structure that I use when I'm thinking about writing a short opinion article, and it works for letters and shorter things as well. I'll speak here about paragraphs, but obviously it's going to be broken up differently for reading online. So first of all, you're going to set the scene. So it might be with your story, but you know, what is the status quo on this issue? Give an example or a story, or talk about something that's in current view, maybe a quote from someone else, just the question is, or even raise some data, but the question is, what's wrong with this? What's the problem here? And then also in setting the scene, try and address what, if anything, has been tried or discussed or planned. So you've got a little jumping off point for the rest of your article. The next bit is the main game, the substantial argument that you're going to make, where you're going to introduce new ideas and solutions. So if possible, you need to be practical with this. What needs to happen for your ideas to get off the ground here and now? You need to be open, so discuss any genuine downsides. And as we discussed, if you can, slay the naysayers before they get a chance. Bring up those dissenting views and address the elephants in the room. And the last bit is the most fun bit, the bringing it home. So that's your final paragraph or your final section, where you can strongly restate the issue or problem, summarize the new ideas you brought forward, and conclude with a clear and memorable message. Now, I've got a little extra tip here, because we've been talking about stories and they are a great way to start off. If you've told a story at the beginning of your piece, try to go back to it. You want to leave that image in people's minds. For instance, if I was writing an opinion piece about harnessing environmental grief to empower communities, I'd go back to my story about Yunbunun Magnetic Island. And I'd talk about my recent experience of snorkeling back in Arthur Bay and the heartbreaking loss of coral. And I'd talk about suddenly seeing Shelley the turtle and swimming close to her for a long time and watching her feed and take breaths as she went about her day in the decimated bay. And I talk about how Shelley's survival spurred me on. It reminded me that even as we feel we've lost so much, there is so much we can still take action on to protect what's left. So I hope you've been thinking about your pitch during that exhausting monologue. So now it's time to go to the next slide and your pitch. What are you going to talk about? If you could give us a couple of sentences for an outline of your main message, who your audience is going to be, and what platform you'd like to publish on, and what format you think you would use: letter, opinion piece, creative writing. Get creative here. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And as Melissa suggested yesterday, perhaps even if you can't do those 3 steps, just give us a killer title or headline. That would be great as well. And I'll be looking at the chat like this because I'm quite myopic, so don't get frightened. Any of my co-presenters got a good pitch? Oh, there's Melissa's pitch. Why the climate health crisis should be front of mind for Australian voters. That's a good one as we come up to the election. And maybe we need more than one article on that, Melissa. that's the sort of thing that could cover a range of articles from different people telling their own local climate stories, actually. Okay, I've got Nell. Reflecting on your earlier comments about introducing ourselves, Meg, think about how much more I enjoy opinion pieces. Yeah, with some personal elements. I think that's exactly right, Nell. I think if you bring in a personal hook at the very beginning, I just think it takes things so much further. Yeah. And Melissa said, why isn't climate health in front of minds? Yes, good point. Ria, thank you. So Ria's outline is that individual staff actions are great. Well, they're all coming in so fast, I can't read them. Individual staff actions are great, but the real bang for your buck is for health organisations to build sustainability, bike lanes, bike parks, e-scooter charges, water recycling, etc. That would save far more on an ongoing basis than trying to retrofit or relying on staff to reduce, reuse and recycle. Yeah, actually enabling people to take the right steps. That's a really good theme, actually. Rebecca, sorry, that one. And Rebecca, a summary piece for our organisation newsletter, the Crier, about the wrap of the amazing work of our Waste Management Working Party. Yeah. Has been able to achieve in 2024. I'll be trying to get staff feedback of what they've been introduced to in each of our sites. That's great. And get some individual stories there. That would be good. Michelle, controversially, beyond junk food, preventative health needs climate action. So true. Stop stop looking at the wood for the trees. I'm really interested to know if you've been inspired to think about or tell some community climate stories by hearing some of our stories. Hopefully there's a few of those percolating around. And some of the things that came out in the chat earlier could also make a good basis for articles or letters to the editor as well. Taking community action, for instance, in cyclones, your own small acts of climate by preserving energy in the winter and in the summer, what's more. Yeah. That's right. Meg says we need to turn it around from being just about preventive health, being about personal actions, to being about the larger environment. Okay. Are we out of time on the pictures? The good news here is that we're very willing to receive them at Croakey at any time. And with that, I think I should hand over to Melissa.
Okay, so we're back to doing some more pictures. So to let you know about two events that we're going to do next year in the lead up to the federal election, and really like to acknowledge Lena for providing some funding support for this. So we're going to do two climate health webinars. If you haven't participated in any of our Croakey Live events, the idea is that we organise webinars as a platform for doing journalism. So we will assemble two webinar panels to have a discussion, hopefully with stories from different communities about what climate health action is being taken. So we'd really love it if some of the people participating here today or your wider networks would like to give us some ideas for these panels, people we maybe don't hear from all the time, or places that we don't hear from enough, about how, yes, that's it. Thanks, Michelle. That's it exactly. So some frontline stories, that's what we're after. So if you want to drop some ideas into the chat, or please follow up with us afterwards. So we're going to do those two early next year. And also, just in that, keeping with that idea earlier discussed of bringing climate health to all discussions, we're doing a Croakey Live webinar on the 9th of December. And it's going to be focused on health equity leadership for health equity, with a focus on primary health care. But if you want to come along and share some stories about leadership for climate health, that would be really fantastic. You don't have to be on the panel to contribute at our webinars. We love people who are contributing actively via the chat. So that's a really open invitation to you all to come along to those events. And if you want to drop any thoughts in the chat while we're wrapping up for those events, we'd very much welcome them. And I'd just like to, this will be my final goodbye. So before I hand over to Meg to wrap up, just really like to thank you all for attending, and panel colleagues, Meg, Nell and Ruth, it's really been wonderful hearing from you and working with you on this. So over to you, Meg.
I'm done. Thanks, Melissa. And Nell and Ruth, just learned so much. So for our final exercise, who's got a bit of paper and a pen? Or who's got a device with a notes thing? Write down or type number 1, number 2, and number 3, and let's fill them out. What's one thing I can do? What's one thing you can do? Reflecting on things we've heard, the time to think about our spheres of influence and our local environment, organisations, controversies, headlines. Write down one thing I can do. Now write down a second thing you can do. It's a second thing you can do from here. I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed, but I'm going to push myself to a third thing I can do. I'm going to exit our time together today with a little list of 3 things I can do, whether they're short, medium, or long term. I'm going to give you a little hint and maybe give you a link, what I'm going to be working on. With Croakey Health Media coming here to Candos for what we call Croakey Go, which is walking as an act of journalism. Yeah, keep post in the chat too if you've done your bit of work. And I think there's been about 12 Croakey Goes around the country, and often discuss climate health issues. And coming here to Candos, there's a footpath 7 kilometres to the next town, Ralston, that our Ruth has connections to in both towns. So we're building on some connections. And I know that during this walk, issues will come up about the Bowden's silver mine, which is actually more like a lead mine, 2 kilometres from a public school with a waterway there, and extensive waterway connection with risks of poisoning. Bushfires will probably come up, and really limited access to healthcare, road safety, but also the strengths of this community, recycling and sharing too, that come up. So I've got a few tasks for me to do to continue to promote Croakey Go in the short term, and then some other prison healthcare issues, especially around climate change in prisons, medium and longer term. So thinking back to where we started, that time to take the opportunity to hear our own voice. Who am I? How do I introduce myself? What matters to me that I can share with others to relate to them? Create new networks, but also use my spheres of influence and their networks that create new networks. Thinking about stories that matter and following Ruth's tips and process for writing articles or other content. Could be the radio, could be Deadly KRR radio. And then that little bit of dedicating myself to some actions to take. Being part of this group and network for some accountability. And the next things to connect to, the Croakey Live on December 9. Come, check back in, give us an update in the chat about actions that you've taken or plans that you've made, and continue to expect the best about who we can be and how we can be in order to protect and care for this great planet and planetary system and our Mother Earth. So on that note, well, thank you so very much for joining us, because you can hear us processing and working, and we need colleagues along that journey. And we wish you very best in your domain and your local environment. Please accept our invitation for reaching out to Croakey and contributing to Croakey in ways that you can. And we can keep the chat open just to keep hearing from others in our last few minutes together as well. We'll summarise today for an article, so you can pop that as number 4 on your list. Check out what did they say about that event as well. So I'm just going to close by actually opening up in case anyone does want to say any last thoughts before we sign off. Yes, come to Candos. A little bit worried about the temperature it might be. We'll start our walk at 9 a.m, 9 till 11. I'm chuffed, Rebecca, that you know where Candos is. It's 1,200 in our population and 800 in Ralston next door. Very strong leadership of Davey here. You could check out the Croakey website for Croakey always has our acknowledgement of country and some words about the photo. Yes, the gluten-free cafe here. And the charity shop. Also on my list is to check out the Lena members. I've done that before, Nell, but I'm keen to have another look and certainly more actively engage some of those with prison health.
Very quickly as well.
Congratulations.
So I'm sure you'll see a few new ones.
Well, look forward to seeing some headlines too. That's a challenge, thinking in headlines. I can get the content and the story, but I always need help with a title. I'll always have about 6 options and need help. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, we'll sign off. We'll say Guayu till next time. See you later, Mandang. Thank you so very much for being here with us today.